On the 29th of August 2009, a funeral mass took place at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Basilica in the city of Boston in Massachusetts. It was a grand affair. 3 former United States presidents and the serving president of the day, Barack Obama, all attended. Obama gave one of the eulogies. He noted of the deceased that he was a man who had achieved a lot, but also suffered, stating, "He lost 2 siblings by the age of 16. He saw 2 more taken violently from a country that loved them. He said goodbye to his beloved sister Eunice in the final days of his life. He narrowly survived a plane crash, watched 2 children struggle with cancer, buried 3 nephews, and experienced personal failings and setbacks in the most public way possible." He was speaking of Edward Kennedy, known to all as Ted Kennedy, the youngest son of Joe Kennedy and the last of the generation of the family that had dominated American political life in the 1960s. During that latter era, Ted had buried 2 of his older brothers, President John F. Kennedy, or JFK, and the 1968 presidential candidate, Robert, or Bobby Kennedy. In contrast to his brothers, Ted lived a long life, becoming one of the foremost leaders of the Democratic Party and playing a substantial role in the country's politics over a period of more than 40 years. But now it was at an end. Ted's funeral didn't so much mark his passing as the passing of the Kennedy dynasty from the front ranks of American life. 2 years later, when Ted's son Patrick decided not to seek re-election as a member for Rhode Island in the House of Representatives, it was the first time since 1947 that a member of the Kennedys had not held political office. And yet, it had all started so humbly. The Kennedys were descended from 2 of the hundreds of thousands of Irish people who fled Ireland in the late 1840s in the wake of the terrible potato famine that had struck the country. This is the remarkable story of the Kennedy family, their unlikely rise and gradual decline in American life. The Kennedys do come from a kind of ruling stock. Centuries ago, before Ireland was fully conquered and extensively colonized by the English crown, the island was divided into dozens of lordships of varying sizes. For instance, there were great lordships, the rulers of which claimed to be regional kings of parts of the island, like the O'Neills and O'Donnells of Ulster in the north, or the MacMurrough Kavanaghs in Leinster, and the O'Briens in Munster in the south. The O'Kennedys were one of these lordly groups. They held power in the Ormond region of Ireland, around the counties of Tipperary and Kilkenny, in late medieval times, on the southern edge of the Irish Midlands. This lordship was already under threat from the Anglo-Irish Earls of Ormond when the Tudor conquest of Ireland began in the 16th century. Later branches of the family were dispersed as new colonial projects were undertaken. Some ended up going north to Mayo on the west coast, others drifted to Antrim and East Ulster, while more still went eastwards to Leinster. It was here that the American Kennedys have their origin. The founder of the dynasty, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, Ted's great-grandfather, was born in Dunganstown, in the county of Wexford, in the southeastern corner of Ireland in 1823. The son of a farmer of very modest means, no one can have suspected when he was born that one of his grandsons, and through him his great-grandchildren and beyond, would achieve so much. At the time in Ireland, the vast majority of land was owned by large landlords of either Anglo-Irish, English, or Scottish heritage, while they leased out their estates to smallholders who eked out a living growing the potato crop, which had become the staple food of the island since it was introduced to Europe from the Americas back in the 16th century. The island was comparatively overpopulated for its level of economic productivity. The population had peaked at over 8 million in the early 1840s, a figure which is higher than live on the island of Ireland today, and which was much higher than the average population during the 20th century. This meant that a failure in the potato crop was perilous, and some years there were bad harvests. Patrick Kennedy knew all about this. As he grew up in Wexford, he helped out on his father's farm and knew how precarious life could be when a bad crop came in. It was with dismay that he saw the crop start to completely fail, with a black, blighted look to it in the mid-1840s. These were not poor quality potatoes. They were completely inedible. The potato blight had arrived in Europe on board the first steamships. Within a year, people began to die as famine set in across Ireland. Then, as Black 48, the colloquial name for 1848, arrived, people began to flee. Hundreds of thousands of Irish men, women and children boarded disease-ridden ships to the Americas in search of food and a better life. Patrick Kennedy was among them in 1849. He quickly found work as a cooper, making barrels, after arriving at Boston. He also met and married an Irish woman, Bridget Murphy, who had just arrived in America as well. They had 5 children together in quick succession before Patrick died in 1858 from either cholera or tuberculosis. Bridget, who had been a maid before becoming a mother, returned to work as a hairdresser, and the family survived. But it was not an easy start, as anti-Irish sentiment was running extremely high in the US in the second half of the 19th century on account of the absolute deluge of Irish migrants into the country from the famine era down to the early 20th century. The branch of the Kennedy family that would become ubiquitous in American life is descended from Patrick's youngest child, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, better known as P.J. Kennedy. He was born on the 14th of January 1858. The disease that claimed his father's life also took his older brother John the same year that P.J. was born. Therefore, it was young P.J., his mother, and his 3 sisters that had to fend for themselves in Boston in the 1860s and the 1870s. P.J. left school when he was 14 years old to try and help his mother and sisters. He did extremely well, a testament to how hard work could lead to success in America back then. Starting out as a dock worker in Boston, by the 1880s, he had enough money to purchase a saloon or bar in the Haymarket Square district of the city. With the profits from the first establishment, he soon acquired 2 more and set up his own distillery to produce whiskey. Thereafter, political life started to beckon. While the Irish were heavily prejudiced against in America, the same way the Italians and others would be before long, as they arrived in huge numbers, they had figured out that they could literally take over entire neighborhoods and districts if they settled in them in large numbers. This had certainly happened in parts of Boston, and even as he was emerging as a prominent businessman in the city, P.J. Kennedy was also after becoming a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives with the Democratic Party. He held numerous other positions in years to come, though he would never seek to fully diversify into politics. Kennedy was a Boston businessman who dabbled in politics. That pendulum would swing during the lives of his son and his grandchildren. The son in question was Joseph Kennedy Sr., better known simply as Joe Kennedy. While his father had certainly laid the groundwork for the rise of the Kennedys as a major Boston family, Joe Kennedy was the defining figure in the emergence of the Kennedys as a political dynasty that shaped 20th century America. His success in this regard later in life was made possible by his rise as a national business figure in the first half of his life. Born in 1888, Kennedy studied economics at Harvard and then headed for Wall Street, working for numerous brokerage firms like Hayden, Stone & Co. from the mid-1910s onwards. It was a good time to get into this industry. Once the political and economic turmoil that continued in Europe down to 1923, well beyond the end of the First World War in November 1918, started to die down, an economic boom began, known as the Roaring Twenties. Kennedy made a lot of money, both as a stockbroker and through running his own business ventures during these years. Though he was no self-made man, his father's money aided in his rise. For instance, he used a very substantial loan from PJ to muscle in on the Columbia Trust Bank, which was under a financial cloud at the time. He was also appointed to the board of a number of companies in Massachusetts, no doubt benefiting from PJ's status in the state. Still, this shouldn't take entirely from Joe's success. He had a good business acumen, which was demonstrated by his moves into novel industries. For example, in the 1920s, he invested heavily in the film studios in Hollywood and the emergent cinema industry around the country. He did so just as Hollywood was transitioning to the talkies, movies with verbal dialogue instead of captioning, and made a lot of money in the process. There were also persistent rumors over the years that Joe Kennedy was a major bootlegger on the East Coast during the Prohibition period from 1920 to 1933. While the family certainly made a lot of their early wealth from alcohol in PJ's time and had a few casual connections to organized crime outfits in New York, there is no concrete evidence to prove Joe Kennedy was involved in bootlegging. It is worth assessing exactly how wealthy Joe Kennedy became, for the rise of his sons to the national political stage was directly enabled by his wealth. While he never disclosed how much he owned, and this was back before things like rich lists started to estimate people's wealth publicly, historians are confident his wealth eventually stretched into the hundreds of millions, making him a billionaire in modern terms. He got a leg up from his father, then expanded that into millions of dollars in the 1910s and 1920s, before building and building in the decades that followed based on his existing capital. One of the things which magnified his wealth in the long run was his investment in property in the early 1930s. Property prices had collapsed in the midst of the Great Depression, and Joe acquired a lot of real estate, a no-brainer investment for someone who could afford to buy lots of property and sit on it 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years, until it dramatically reappreciated in value. Similarly, his earlier investments in the film studios simply continued to create more and more money over time. Joe was also beginning to spread out the family wealth, setting up trusts for his children and buying up properties for the family around Massachusetts and in other locations. These were the cogs of financial power that would allow his children to focus on politics and other endeavors without worrying about money in years to come. Joe Kennedy's wealth was the lubricant which promoted the Kennedys' roles in American life as the 20th century progressed. Like his father before him, Joe always had a side interest in politics. This began later in life for him. He was well into his 40s when he acquired the post of chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934, a regulatory body within the American financial world, which Kennedy, as a major Wall Street player, was a logical fit for. The SEC had just been set up by the new administration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in order to regulate Wall Street and ensure that the excessive speculation which brought about the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed did not happen again. His appointment highlights Kennedy's ties to the Roosevelt administration from its earliest years, and he would continue to prosper in politics for as long as Roosevelt was in office. For instance, Kennedy was made a head of the U.S. Maritime Commission during Roosevelt's second term. It was a reciprocal relationship. Kennedy had published a book entitled I'm for Roosevelt in 1936, the year of the presidential election, which saw Roosevelt win his second term after a landslide victory over Alf Langdon. In the book, Kennedy had outlined the case in favor of Roosevelt's economic strategy, the New Deal, against its many critics. The support of a prominent business leader like Kennedy was a boon for Roosevelt's campaign, and he continued to pay the debt back. In 1938, the president appointed him as the U.S. ambassador to Britain. Kennedy would serve in the post for 2 years, a critical period in Europe's politics as the continent descended into the Second World War. Kennedy took up his post in London, just as the Germans were about to complete the Anschluss Union with Austria in March 1938. He was a controversial ambassador. Kennedy was clearly anti-Semitic, and he also favored the policy of Britain appeasing Nazi Germany. When Winston Churchill, the great opponent of appeasement, was appointed as the new Prime Minister of Britain in May 1940 and began acquiring financial aid from Roosevelt in Washington, Kennedy's position was no longer tenable. In September 1940, he left for home after being recalled. Joe Kennedy would not use his entry into national politics during the Roosevelt administrations as a springboard for a run at high political office himself. Instead, he developed the idea that he could use his wealth and status to make one of his sons President of the United States in times to come. He had numerous options to choose from. Joe and his wife Rose, whom he had married in 1914, had 9 children in all, 4 boys and 5 girls. The eldest of the sons was Joseph Jr., born in 1915, followed by John, known within the family and to those who knew him as Jack, in 1917, Robert or Bobby in 1925, and finally Edward or Ted in 1932. The 5 girls were Rosemary, born in 1918, Kathleen or Kick, born in 1920, Eunice, born in 1921, Patricia, born in 1924, and Jean, born in 1928. By the time he began acquiring political positions himself within the Roosevelt governments in the 1930s, Joe was already preparing Joseph Jr. to enter politics. The goal was that he would become president one day. No mean feat if it could be achieved. There was still a serious degree of anti-Irish American and anti-Roman Catholic sentiment in large parts of America in those days, and if Joseph Jr. Kennedy was ever to become President of the United States, he would probably have to do so as the first Roman Catholic to enter the Oval Office. Back in 1928, Al Smith, an otherwise popular and capable political leader, had lost the U.S. presidential election to the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover, in a landslide after anti-Catholic sentiment had become a factor in the election, as Smith was a Catholic with both Irish and Italian heritage. Thus, the Kennedys faced an uphill battle in this respect. In the end, it was not anti-Irish or anti-Catholic sentiment which prevented Joseph Jr. from ascending to high political office in America. It was the onset of the first stages of what has been called the Kennedy curse. This is a tragic element of the story of the family whereby they have experienced an unusually large number of premature deaths, illnesses, assassinations, and other family tragedies. It began during the Second World War and lasted down to modern times. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was its first victim. On the 12th of August 1944, while taking part in Operation Aphrodite, a mission to launch old Allied Army planes against German targets remotely with explosives on board, he and his team were killed in the skies over England after the explosives on their plane detonated long before they should have, and before Kennedy and the others had bailed out of the plane. This put an end to his father's ambitions to have Joseph Jr. become president one day, though he would soon simply transfer those ambitions to the second oldest son, John, or Jack. Meanwhile, Kathleen Kennedy, who had remained in England and married into the British aristocracy, was killed in a plane crash while flying over France on holidays in the early summer of 1948. The Kennedy curse would involve aviation disasters to an unusual extent over the years. Finally, Rosemary Kennedy had suffered a great injustice in 1941. She was in her early 20s and had become erratic with mood swings. After the family returned from Britain in 1940, Jo Kennedy was advised by doctors that she should undergo a new kind of operation, which at the time was being championed as a cure for behavioral problems. It was called a lobotomy. In retrospect, Jo Kennedy cannot be entirely blamed for agreeing to what medical practitioners proposed, and nobody knew how dreadful a medical innovation lobotomies were at the time. Yet, the manner in which he had Rosemary operated on, without consulting the rest of the family, was unforgivable. The operation was not successful. Rosemary was left with limited cognitive abilities. She would live a long life, and eventually contact was restored with the wider family, though Jo initially had her hidden away in an institution where she was left without her siblings, fully knowing what had happened to her for decades. Rosemary's tragic circumstances aside, the Kennedy family were otherwise a tightly knit unit. As Jo's children grew older, they married and started their own families, often living in different states. However, the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport at Cape Cod in southern Massachusetts provided an anchor for them and a place where they spent holidays and other events together. The Kennedys' association with Hyannisport began back in the mid-1920s, when the young family began holidaying there during the summers in rented houses. In 1928, Jo purchased one of the cottages they had vacationed in before and began redeveloping both the house and the site. As the years went by, he acquired additional adjoining properties and gradually built these up into a complex of 3 different houses on a 6-acre site. The main house gives an idea of the extent of the Kennedy compound. It is primarily laid out over 2 sprawling floors, though there are very extensive attic and basement floors as well. The second floor alone has 10 bedrooms of varying sizes and some additional side rooms. The basement includes a small cinema. Sweeping views over Nantucket Sound are seen from the house, and lawns and gardens are laid out around it. Because the Kennedy compound became the site of many election campaigns, and even briefly doubled as a presidential summer White House, the security arrangements around the compound became extensive over the years. The Kennedy compound was in a position to become a summer White House because of Jo Kennedy's second eldest son. After Joseph Jr.'s death during the Second World War, the patriarch of the family turned his attentions towards preparing John to become president one day. John had served in the war as well. Although he survived, he did not come out of it entirely unscathed. Assigned to the US Navy in the South Pacific, he was involved in 2 attacks by the Japanese, in which he earned credit for his help in rescuing numerous men from almost certain death in 1943. He was left with lifelong back injuries, though, that left him increasingly reliant on strong painkillers as he grew older. On returning home, He did not immediately enter politics. A brief stint in journalism was had before he was convinced by his father to stand for election to the U.S. House of Representatives. He won a seat in one of Massachusetts' districts. However, he was initially a disinterested politician, partly because constituency issues and domestic affairs were not things he was intrinsically interested in. His real concern was with international affairs, as the Cold War with the Soviet Union was heating up. Aware that U.S. senators had a much greater role to play in foreign affairs, in 1952 he campaigned to become one of the 2 senators for his home state of Massachusetts. He ran against Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., who Kennedy would coincidentally also be on the ticket against in 1960, as Richard Nixon's proposed vice president in the presidential election of that year. John won a narrow victory with 51% of the vote, claiming a seat in the Senate at just 35 years of age. In the upper house of Congress, he came into his own, putting himself forward on a wide range of issues and acquiring a position on the important Foreign Relations Committee. The Kennedys also took over Massachusetts politics during this period through a sophisticated political machine. When John stood for re-election to the Senate in 1958, he demolished his opponent, Vincent Celeste, with 73% of the vote. Given Kennedy's expanded national character, his growing reputation, and the perception of him as a young, vibrant, photogenic politician, it is not too surprising that he was soon touted as a presidential candidate within the Democratic Party. At the same time, many considered his relative youth an issue, as well as his status as a New England Democrat who leaned liberal in a period when the Democrats were still the party of the southern states and segregation. It was a surprise to many when he was chosen as the party's candidate at the Democratic National Convention in mid-July 1960. To satiate the more conservative and southern element in the party, Lyndon B. Johnson, an old-school Texan in his 50s, was selected as his vice presidential running mate. They would stand against Richard Nixon as the Republican Party's presidential candidate, and Cabot Lodge, Kennedy's old sparring partner from the 1952 Senate election in Massachusetts, as his running mate. It was one of the most closely fought presidential elections in U.S. history. Kennedy would eventually win 49.72% of the vote, with Nixon acquiring 49.55%. However, despite how close the popular vote was, Kennedy won 303 votes of the Electoral College, with Nixon trailing with 219. In the end, the decision to run Kennedy was a good one. His position on the ticket meant that Democrats won most of the states in his native New England and other northern states like New York and Pennsylvania, which they otherwise could have lost had a more traditional Southern Democrat been on the ticket in such a close election. Kennedy's time as president was extremely eventful. For instance, he had inherited a major problem in Cuba from his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, and the CIA was already preparing an ill-conceived invasion of the Caribbean island using some Cuban opponents of the new regime. The Bay of Pigs invasion turned into a fiasco and convinced the Cuban government of Fidel Castro that it needed to draw closer to the Soviet Union for protection from the Americans. This, in turn, led to the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, during which the world came closer to nuclear war than at any time before or since. At home, the country was rocked by the civil rights movement and the call for complete racial equality that would end segregation in the southern states, a legacy of the post-Civil War era. This divided the Democratic Party, the traditional party of the South since the Civil War a century earlier, but Kennedy eventually decided to champion the civil rights cause. Elsewhere, in an era when it was quite reasonable to believe that the Soviet Union were winning the Cold War, Kennedy oversaw massive investment in NASA to lead the race to the moon, and also was the key figure when it came to increasing direct American involvement in the war between North and South Vietnam. Several of these issues were considered divisive, and Kennedy had made a lot of enemies within state bodies like the CIA for criticizing their actions in planning the Bay of Pigs and other endeavors. This is why so many theories have emerged around Kennedy's assassination by Lee Harvey Oswald while driving through Dallas, Texas on the 22nd of November 1963. With JFK's assassination, the political baton in the family was passed to his two younger surviving brothers. The next eldest, Robert Kennedy, known to everyone who knew him as Bobby, already had a substantial presence in national politics. He had served briefly in the Navy at the end of the Second World War, before returning home to study law at Harvard. Like his older brother, he was interested in writing and journalism, and several of the Kennedys published multiple books each. After a brief period working with the Boston Post, he entered politics in the 1950s, though not immediately as an elected official. Instead, a lot of his work focused on organized crime and its links to the Teamsters unions. His questioning of figures like Jimmy Hoffa, the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, before the U.S. Senate's Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, made headline news around America for months in the late 1950s. This work provided ample justification for JFK to appoint his brother as U.S. Attorney General in January 1961 as part of his new administration. Therefore, Bobby was front and center during his brother's years as president, involved in things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the administration's response to the Civil Rights Movement. He played a leading role in responding to various crises, such as that aroused by the commencement of the Berlin Wall to divide the German city between East and West Berlin. For instance, it was Bobby that helped organize the Vienna Summit in June 1961 that had sought to develop better relations between the American and Soviet leadership. The summit is usually credited with having allowed JFK and Khrushchev to form enough understanding of one another's motives that when the Cuban Missile Crisis began, over a year later, they knew neither wanted to descend into nuclear war. Bobby was unsure how to respond after his brother's assassination. There was an argument that he could have sought to run in the 1964 U.S. presidential election as his brother's obvious political successor. Lyndon Johnson was not popular within the administration, and it was believed that John had intended to replace him as vice president on the 1964 ticket had he not been assassinated. Still, Johnson attached his mast to the civil rights movement and managed to win the 1964 election. Bobby didn't attempt to challenge him. Instead, he ran for and won a seat as one of the U.S. senators for the state of New York, entering Congress at the start of 1965. Over the next few years, he established himself as a critic within the Democratic Party of Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War. Although his brother had been the key figure in initiating direct U.S. involvement in the conflict, it was really after the draft. A form of randomized conscription was introduced in 1964 that the war escalated dramatically, with hundreds of thousands of American troops being sent to South Vietnam and an intense bombing campaign beginning. In this environment, Bobby broke with his family's previous advocacy of intervention in Indochina and became an opponent of the war in Vietnam. That Bobby changed his views on the Vietnam War was not entirely unusual. The Kennedys were known for altering their policy approaches. For instance, the family's politicians had been supporters of Senator Joseph McCarthy when he drove the Red Scare against potential and imagined communists in America in the 1950s. Their attitude towards the civil rights movement had been frosty in the beginning before wholeheartedly embracing it. This was not necessarily blatant political opportunism. Realizing that a policy has gone wrong and that you need to change your view can be perceived as an act of political maturity. That does appear to have been the case with regard to Kennedy's outlook on the Vietnam War. Things had changed immensely in Indochina since his brother first began filtering a modest enough number of troops into the region, and by 1968, Bobby had concluded that the war could not be won, and further involvement was untenable. The 1968 US presidential election was looking to be a highly contentious one. The Vietnam War had turned American society and politics on its head, and there was an enormous anti-war movement emerging, one which in turn fueled a burgeoning counterculture. The Republican Party had a fairly clear strategy. They had reframed themselves under Barry Goldwater's direction years earlier as the party of law and order in a country which many people perceived as changing too quickly, with rising levels of drug use and issues of urban crime. They fixed on Richard Nixon as their candidate, who had run on several Republican tickets before as vice president. The Democrats were in complete disarray. Although he had theoretically served parts of 2 terms, Lyndon Johnson had only won 1 election to the presidency and had only served 1 full term. The partial second term he had served after succeeding as president from the vice presidency after JFK was assassinated in 1963 did not impede him from running again under the 2-term limit established under the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution. And yet Johnson was an enormously unpopular president by 1968, and it was clear he would be defeated if he ran again. Eventually, he was cajoled into agreeing not to stand, and a highly contentious Democratic primary race began. 2 major candidates were Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota and Hubert Humphrey. Both candidates were running on an anti-war platform, pledging to pull America out of Vietnam. Bobby soon decided to enter the race alongside them. The campaign which followed was one of the biggest what-if moments of American history. Kennedy was an excellent speaker and spoke with conviction about how the war needed to be ended in Vietnam, while also dealing with the problems of American society. It was a politically charged moment. On the 4th of April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement since the late 1950s, was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The Tet Offensive by the Viet Cong was underway in Indochina, and eventually, when the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago in late August, it would be accompanied by large protests and an excessively violent police crackdown that was televised around the country. Bobby Kennedy wasn't there. His campaign had been gaining traction in the months following Luther King's assassination, and it looked possible that he could win the race to become the Democratic Party's candidate heading into the presidential election. But just after midnight, on the 5th of June 1968, while campaigning in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles as part of the California primaries, Kennedy was shot from close range by an assailant named Sirhan Sirhan. The fatal bullet entered his head behind his right ear. Several others nearby were wounded by additional shots before Sirhan was disarmed. Kennedy survived initially and was still alive when taken to hospital. However, he failed to recover and he was pronounced dead just over 24 hours later. As with JFK's assassination 5 years earlier, numerous conspiracy theories attached themselves to Bobby Kennedy's assassination, including reports of a second gunman. Yet, given the crowded environment in which Sirhan carried out the assassination, in the walkways through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, these seem fairly implausible, as a second shooter would have been spotted. Ted Kennedy delivered the eulogy at Bobby Kennedy's funeral. He was the last son of Joe Kennedy, his 3 older brothers all dead, 1 in war, 2 by assassination, while he had also lost a sister to an aviation disaster and another had been lobotomized and institutionalized a quarter of a century earlier. Unsurprisingly, he referenced much of this in the eulogy, stating, quote, "We loved him as a brother and as a father and as a son. From his parents and from his older brothers and sisters, Joe and Kathleen and Jack, he received an inspiration which he passed on to all of us. He gave us strength in time of trouble, wisdom in time of uncertainty, and sharing in time of happiness. He will always be by our side." By then, Ted was already a U.S. Senator. While his brothers had headed to the White House, Teddy had taken up the mantle of the leading Kennedy politician in Massachusetts. He used it as a springboard to become one of the state's 2 senators in 1962, a post he would hold for 47 years. He had also played a role in managing John's presidential campaign. He barely escaped the Kennedy curse in 1964 when he was involved in a plane accident in Massachusetts, though he was left badly injured and, like his brother John, who never fully recovered from his war wounds, Ted was left with back problems and other physical ailments for the rest of his life. Though there were many who called for him to swiftly step in to become a late candidate at the 1968 Democratic Convention, Ted was far too emotionally flattened by Bobby's death to do so. Instead, over the next few years, Ted built up a solid Senate career, although he was distracted by family health issues, notably one son with severe asthma and another with bone cancer, which required a leg amputation to stop the aggressive spread thereof. Talk of Ted Kennedy running for the presidency continued uninterrupted after 1968. While commentators understood why he had refrained from jumping very late into the race as a kind of replacement for Bobby in 1968, a lot of people thought it was a foregone conclusion that he would eventually run in 1972 or in 1976. This didn't materialize. There is a clear reason why. On the 18th of July, 1969, Ted had attended a party at Chappaquiddick Island in southeastern Massachusetts. He left shortly after 11 p.m. and was driving with Mary Jo Kopechne, a former aide to Bobby's presidential campaign the previous year. During the journey, Ted took a wrong turn down a lane, which led to a narrow bridge. The car skidded on the bridge and fell off into the water. Ted swam free from the car, but Mary Jo drowned. He later maintained that he had tried to rescue her from the vehicle. What might have been largely construed as a tragic accident became a major controversy when Ted failed to report the incident to police until 10 a.m. the following morning, many hours after it had first occurred. Kennedy later went on television and stated that his actions during the 8 or 9 hour window before he reported the crash made no sense to him. Perhaps the weight of another death in close proximity to Bobby's caused his peculiar behavior. In any event, the Chappaquiddick incident became a national controversy, and it was this which is understood to be the reason why Ted refrained from running in either the 1972 or the 1976 presidential elections. Although legally, he only received a 2-month suspended sentence for leaving the scene of a crime. He did belatedly challenge the incumbent Democratic President Jimmy Carter in 1980, but he was unsuccessful in gaining the nomination. Carter subsequently lost in a landslide to Ronald Reagan. It was not just the Kennedy men that made their mark on the world. Several Kennedy women did as well. This couldn't really happen in the realm of electoral politics, which was overwhelmingly dominated by men for 3/4 of the 20th century, and even then only slowly changed. Prior to the 1980s, for example, there had only been 14 women to ever hold a seat in the US Senate. 6 of these had been co-opted in, without election, to fill seats vacated by their husbands. That means only 8 female senators were elected in US history prior to 1980, a sign of how unlikely it was that the Kennedy women would ever rise to the status of the Kennedy men in the country's politics. Nevertheless, they rose to prominence in other ways. Rose Kennedy was the matriarch of the Kennedy family, the wife of Joe Kennedy and mother of JFK, Bobby, Ted, and the others. She campaigned energetically for her sons at various times between the 1940s and 1970s, though she had reduced mobility in later life. Rose also worked with many different charities and was known for her advocacy with the Roman Catholic Church as well. In later life, she developed a reputation for promoting the position of senior citizens in American life. Rose's charitable work often focused on people with disabilities. This was something which rubbed off on her daughter Eunice. Eunice is probably the most well-known today of Rose and Joe Kennedy's daughters on account of her having founded the Special Olympics. From her youth, she worked in various government departments, including a stint in the State Department after the family returned home from Britain during the Second World War. As such, she had experience of the internal workings of government bureaucracy and running large organizations from a young age. After the war, she worked with various women's shelters and other aid groups. During the 1950s, her charitable work began to focus on people with intellectual and physical disabilities. She was inspired in this, to some extent, by Rosemary's plight. After she was given a lobotomy back in 1941, Rosemary had effectively been hidden away from the rest of the family by her father, though they had some vague knowledge that she had an operation that went wrong. It was only when their father had a stroke that left him considerably impaired in 1961 that Eunice and the others were fully apprised of what had happened. It was Eunice who revealed the full details of Rosemary's condition to the public in a newspaper interview a year later. That same year, she founded a summer camp for people with disabilities, and it was out of this that the idea for the Special Olympics emerged. The first such event was held in 1968 in Chicago. Since then, it has grown to include participants from over 170 countries. The event is now held every 4 years, and the 17th edition is scheduled to take place in Santiago, in Chile, in 2027. Eunice was awarded a Presidential Medal of Freedom for her work in 1984, the first of a small mountain of awards and honors that followed down to her death in 2009, just 2 weeks before her brother Ted's passing. Eunice was not the only Kennedy woman who made a considerable mark in the second half of the 20th century. Her sister Jean did so as well, and in a way which mirrored Eunice in a lot of ways. In 1974, she founded Very Special Arts, an organization set up to promote the involvement of those with intellectual and physical disabilities in the arts. The primary goal was to provide access to training to younger people with disabilities, though the program was as open as possible in its remit, with the focus also being on everything from painting and drawing to the performing arts like singing, acting, and dancing. The VSA, as it became known for short, was not restricted to the United States, and over time, VSA centers were set up in dozens of different countries. The idea was simple but effective, and again must have been inspired to some degree by Rosemary and her situation, to make the arts accessible to those who had generally been omitted therefrom as a result of their disabilities. In the process, it would make their lives better. The VSA has worked with over 300,000 people since it was set up over 40 years ago. Jean later went on to serve as the US ambassador to Ireland, appointed by President Bill Clinton after he entered office in 1993, and continuing the Kennedy family's strong ties to Ireland, the dynasty's ancestral homeland. She was the last surviving of the children of Joe and Rose Kennedy in the end, only passing away on the 17th of June 2020 at 92 years of age. In 1999, the Kennedy curse, which had been dormant to a degree since the late 1960s, although illness still haunted the family from time to time, struck again. On the 16th of July that summer, a small Piper Saratoga plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean in the waters off Martha's Vineyard, an island near Cape Cod, and the Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port. The plane was being piloted at the time by John F. Kennedy Jr., son and namesake of President Kennedy. His wife, Carolyn, and her sister, Lauren, were also on board the plane at the time. Yet another aviation disaster had claimed the lives of members of the Kennedy family. In this case, it appears that Kennedy, who was piloting the plane, became disorientated as he was trying to land at night and crashed into the water after his spatial awareness was lost. All three died in the accident. It was not the only incident after the assassinations of the 1960s. A son of Bobby Kennedy, David, had died from a drug overdose in 1974 in a family with a history of substance abuse issues. Another of Bobby's sons, Michael, was killed in a skiing accident in Aspen in Colorado on New Year's Eve in 1997. And two of Bobby's grandchildren, whose line of the family had suffered in particular in recent times, lost their lives in quick succession in 2019 and 2020. Saoirse Kennedy died from a drug overdose, while Maeve Kennedy and her son Gideon, just 8 years old at the time, died in a drowning accident while on a canoeing trip in the Chesapeake Bay. When the Martha's Vineyard accident occurred in 1999, and throughout the latter stages of the 20th century and into the 2000s, Ted Kennedy was always viewed as the family patriarch. He had, for instance, inherited the Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port and was the most publicly visible of all the Kennedys. He never ran for president again after his failed effort to displace Jimmy Carter in 1980. This is not to say that his career was not without success. As a senator of 47 years, he became known as the Lion of the Senate, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party on many issues over many years. A cause that was close to him was the conflict in Northern Ireland. The 6 northern counties of Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom after the Republic of Ireland gradually acquired its independence in stages during the 1920s and 1930s. Severe religious prejudices were expressed here between ethnically British Protestants and ethnically Irish Roman Catholics. These erupted into conflict in the late 1960s. Kennedy took an interest in events there from the beginning, the birth country of his great-grandparents. Because of the level of distrust of British politicians which existed amongst the Irish Republican movement in Northern Ireland, US politicians, particularly Irish-American ones, played a major role in furthering the Northern Ireland peace process in the 1980s and 1990s. Kennedy was central to brokering it on the American side. Elsewhere, he championed a range of different causes over the years, notably healthcare reform in the United States. There were demons, though, too. Kennedy was known to periodically drink heavily, imbibing more in certain periods than others, and it has been theorized that he suffered from a form of post-traumatic stress disorder brought about by the tumultuous events of the 1960s. When he died in 2009, it was certainly the end of an era in many respects, as the last of JFK and Bobby Kennedy's brothers passed away. The Kennedy family continues to play a role in American life, although a much less prominent one than it did in the 20th century. For instance, Maria Shriver was the First Lady of California between 2003 and 2011, during which time her husband, Arnold Schwarzenegger, was the Governor of California. She is the daughter of Eunice Kennedy from her marriage to Sergeant Shriver. In 2013, the Kennedys also re-entered political office after a brief hiatus when Joe Kennedy III was elected to the House of Representatives, representing the 4th District of Massachusetts. He is the grandson of Bobby Kennedy and the son of Joe Kennedy II, who himself had served as a representative of the 8th District in the state between 1987 and 1999. Joe Kennedy II later went on to found the Citizens Energy Corporation, which works to provide cheap home energy to low-income families in New England. Joseph Kennedy III briefly came to prominence in 2018 after he was selected to give the Democratic Party's response to President Donald Trump's State of the Union address. Kennedy hoped to use it as a springboard to the U.S. Senate. However, he lost a race for the Democratic primary against the incumbent there, Ed Markey, in 2020. After that, Joseph gave up his place in Congress to become the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland in Joe Biden's administration, continuing the Kennedy family's role in the Northern Ireland peace process. Another scion of the family, Caroline Kennedy, a daughter of JFK and Jackie Kennedy Onassis, served as U.S. Ambassador to Australia between 2022 and 2024. Thus, while the Kennedys are no longer quite as prominent in U.S. politics and society as they once were, they continue to occupy important positions. The story of the Kennedys seems to never fully end. While the family's role in frontline American politics seemed to have broadly ended in the aftermath of Ted Kennedy's passing in 2009, recent years have witnessed the rise of a new Kennedy to the national stage. Robert Kennedy Jr., or RFK Jr., is one of 11 children from Bobby Kennedy's marriage to Ethel Kennedy. He is consequently a nephew of President JFK. RFK Jr. has had a peculiar life in many respects. Troubled by the assassination of his father when he was a teenager and other events, he developed a serious drug problem in his younger years and has been blamed by several members of the family for acting as a bad influence on siblings and cousins in this regard. He subsequently quit narcotics and became a prominent environmentalist, involved in many national campaigns, moving into the field of law over time to campaign legally against environmental degradation. In more recent times, his preoccupation shifted towards health matters. This was not entirely unconnected to his earlier work. After all, environmentalism is often about maintaining clean waterways and the like to keep people healthy within local communities. Over time, though, RFK Jr.'s growing focus was on vaccines and food additives, notably the use of carcinogenic industrial byproducts as food colorants, something which would not be allowed in almost any other developed country. His views on vaccines are much more controversial. It was on this platform that Kennedy ran as an independent candidate in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. He had a small but important base of support, so when he dropped out and endorsed Donald Trump in the election, he did so in return for a promise that he would be given the office of Secretary of Health and Human Services. He has been in that role since February 2025. His stance on many matters remains controversial, primarily on vaccines, as there has been a large measles outbreak in several U.S. states in 2025. The Kennedys, whether one likes or loathes their politics, were one of the most important political dynasties in 20th century America. Nobody, can deny that. Theirs was also such an improbable story. Unlike a great many other families that would produce a US president one day, they didn't have an ancestor who arrived in the 17th or 18th centuries. Instead, Patrick Kennedy arrived at the city of Boston in 1849, one of the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from the Irish potato famine by heading to America at that time. His life there was short, and he died 9 years later. He left behind a son, though, P.J. Kennedy, who went on to enjoy a very successful business and political career within Boston and Massachusetts. It was the springboard the family needed. P.J.'s own son, Joe Kennedy, would in turn become immensely wealthy and entered politics in the mid-1930s as head of the newly formed Securities and Exchange Commission, and then as the US ambassador to Britain in the run-up to and the early stages of the Second World War. A controversial character, Joe developed the ambition for one of his sons to become President of the United States. That goal was achieved in 1960, when John Kennedy won the US presidential election and became the youngest president in US history. Many others would make their names as well from the family, from Bobby's presidential run in 1968 to Ted's long career and Eunice Kennedy's founding of the Special Olympics. But throughout, the Kennedy curse brought suffering too. John and Bobby were both assassinated within 5 years of each other in 1963 and 1968. Numerous members of the family have died in aviation accidents, and others have suffered in other ways. The Kennedys are not an entirely spent force in American life, as the rise to public prominence of RFK Jr. in recent years shows, though they will always be associated with the 20th century, and especially the 1960s, an era in which an American dynasty seemingly flew too close to the sun. What do you think of the Kennedys? Were they a family of overly privileged, wealthy people who tried to claim power in American society without really changing that much? Or are they a tragic dynasty of individuals who genuinely tried to change American society for the better, often suffering great loss as a result? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.